In August 1942, the humid, suffocating silence of the Solomon Islands jungle was broken by something the Japanese Empire never expected. The sound of American engines echoed over the waters of Guadalcanal, a name that until then meant little to the world. But in the months that followed, it would become synonymous with horror, endurance, and fear. Guadalcanal would be the place where Japan began to understand that the empire of the rising sun was not invincible, and that the United States was ready to fight to the last man, even in the green hell of the tropics. The operation began at dawn on August 7, 1942. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the Americans were on the offensive in the Pacific. The Marines, many of them young, untested and terrified, gazed toward the coastline choked with thick jungle. Their orders were simple but grim: land, advance, and capture the Japanese airfield under construction. The Lunga Point airstrip, later renamed Henderson Field. They had no idea what awaited them there. And for the Japanese, the news of the invasion fell like thunder. Imperial pride had been wounded. Guadalcanal was a vital strategic point, an air bridge that could threaten Japan's communications and supply routes between Rabaul and the southern islands. For the Japanese High Command, retaking Guadalcanal became a matter of honor. But what followed would be unlike any battle they had ever fought before. The jungle of Guadalcanal was no ordinary battlefield. It was a green graveyard. The vegetation suffocated, mosquitoes carried malaria, and the humidity rotted boots, weapons, and flesh alike. Men fell ill before ever seeing the enemy. The Japanese, used to fast, overwhelming victories, soon realized they were trapped in an endless nightmare. In the first weeks, the U.S. Marines seized the airfield with little resistance, but the real battle was just beginning. During the nights that followed, the Japanese launched a series of desperate counterattacks, known to the Americans as the Tokyo Express. Convoys of Japanese destroyers would race through the dark waters of Iron Bottom Sound, unloading troops and supplies under the cover of darkness. And when the sun went down, the screams began. The sounds of drums, distant shouting and gunfire from unseen enemies haunted the nights, but the Marines quickly learned to use the jungle to their advantage. No lights, no talking, no defined front line. They moved through the foliage like shadows, ambushing their enemies, using the terrain, silence, and fear as their weapons. The Japanese began to fear the jungle itself. They were used to being the hunters, not the hunted. But on Guadalcanal, the situation reversed. The forest seemed alive, watching, waiting. And from it came the Americans, filthy, emaciated, faces streaked with mud and blood, appearing from nowhere to strike with deadly precision. The war in the jungle had no heroes, only survivors. A Japanese soldier who fought on Guadalcanal later wrote, "We did not see the Americans. We only heard the whisper of the leaves before the gunfire. It was as if the jungle itself was protecting them." It was a war of ambushes, fear, and starvation. While Japan sent reinforcements by night, their convoys were constantly attacked by American aircraft from Henderson Field. Every ship sunk meant more soldiers stranded, without food, without ammunition, without hope. Soon, Japanese troops began dying not only from bullets, but from hunger and disease. The Americans called Guadalcanal the Green Hell, but for the Japanese it was even worse. Cut off from supplies, many survived only on handfuls of rice or whatever they could scavenge from the jungle. Some resorted to the unthinkable, searching the bodies of the dead for food. Meanwhile, the Marines realized that their enemy was growing weaker and more terrified. But it wasn't just the environment that broke the Japanese. It was the way the Americans fought. The Marines developed tactics that would become legendary: swift ambushes, silent movement, coordinated machine gun and grenade attacks, always exploiting surprise. At night, they dug in and waited in total silence when the Japanese launched their banzai charges, screaming and charging headlong. The Americans let them come close, then unleashed a storm of fire. The scenes were apocalyptic, bodies scattered in the mud, the chirping of insects mixing with the groans of the wounded. The thick air reeked of gunpowder and rain. Guadalcanal was no longer just an island. It was an open wound in the heart of the Pacific. As the months dragged on, Japanese morale collapsed. What was supposed to be a swift reconquest turned into a brutal war of attrition. The soldiers began to fear the jungle and the invisible enemy within it. For many, it was like fighting ghosts. General Harukichi Hyakutake himself wrote in his diary, "The Americans seem to have made a pact with the jungle. It protects them and devours us." On the other side, the Americans suffered too: malaria, dysentery, hunger. Men lost dozens of pounds, living with exhaustion and fear. But one thing kept them going: the conviction that Guadalcanal was the first step toward victory in the Pacific. That belief gave them strength. The battles of the Tenarú River, Bloody Ridge, and the Matanikau became legend. Every yard of ground cost dozens, sometimes hundreds of lives. But slowly, the balance began to shift. American air power grew. Defenses strengthened, and the Japanese began to realize they were trapped in a deadly cage. The Tokyo Express could no longer supply their forces. The Americans had become the hunters. Japanese reports described growing terror. Men refusing to leave their foxholes at night, petrified of encountering the invisible American patrols. The jungle had become an ally of the United States. The fear had changed sides. By February 1943, after 6 months of relentless fighting, the Japanese Empire finally accepted the inevitable. Guadalcanal was lost. The remaining troops were secretly evacuated under the cover of darkness. No flags, no fanfare, no victory. More than 30,000 Japanese soldiers had died. For Japan, Guadalcanal marked the beginning of the end. For the United States, it was the birth of confidence, the proof that the empire could be defeated. After the war, many Japanese veterans refused to speak of Guadalcanal. To them, the island was a nightmare, a place where imperial pride dissolved into mud and blood. And for the Americans, it became a symbol of courage, of an army that learned, amid chaos and despair, how to fight and how to survive. Guadalcanal was more than a military victory. It was a psychological one. The jungle, once the enemy, had become an ally. And the Japanese learned, in the most painful way possible, that no matter how strong one's fighting spirit may be, once fear takes hold, even the most disciplined army crumbles. Thus ended the Battle of Guadalcanal, a conflict that changed the course of the Pacific War and left a deep scar on the souls of all who fought there. A timeless reminder that in war, the greatest enemy is not always the man before you, but the invisible fear growing within your own heart. By late 1942, Guadalcanal had turned into a nightmare neither side could escape. The rain never stopped. The rivers swelled and carried corpses downstream. The jungle reeked of decay, rotting food, rotting flesh, and the metallic taste of blood in the air. The Japanese soldiers, once proud warriors of the emperor, were now shadows of men. Many were so weak they could barely stand. Their uniforms hung loose over their bones, their eyes hollow from starvation and fever. What had begun as a campaign of conquest had become a slow, crawling descent into madness. In the American lines, the Marines watched from their muddy foxholes, hearing faint cries echoing through the jungle at night. Sometimes those voices weren't shouts of battle. They were the moans of men dying alone in the dark, calling for help that would never come. Guadalcanal had become a place where mercy no longer existed. As December approached, the Japanese launched one final series of assaults. General Hyakutake was desperate. Tokyo demanded results. The emperor's forces could not afford to lose face. not after the long chain of victories across Asia and the Pacific. And so, despite disease and exhaustion, Japanese soldiers were ordered to attack Henderson Field once more. They called it Operation Key. To the men, it felt like suicide. But obedience was absolute. When the attack began, the jungle exploded with fire. Machine guns tore through the night. Tracer rounds streaked like red comets over the treetops. And once again, the Japanese charged, screaming, bayonets drawn, driven by honor, by desperation, by madness. The Americans waited in silence, their fingers tight on the triggers. Then, a storm of bullets. The first wave was cut down. Then the second. Then the third. In the morning, the jungle floor was carpeted with bodies, thousands of them. The survivors crawled back into the trees, leaving behind a scene of unspeakable horror. But something had changed. The Americans no longer feared the banzai charge. It had become predictable, an echo of an empire refusing to accept reality, and the Japanese began to understand that their courage, once their greatest strength, had turned into their greatest weakness. American patrols often found diaries on the bodies of Japanese soldiers, pages filled with despair. One read, "We have nothing left. The jungle takes everything, our strength, our spirit, our minds. The Americans do not fear us anymore. They move like ghosts, silent, deadly. Even the trees are on their side." As disease spread, the once mighty Imperial Army began to crumble from within. Commanders could no longer maintain discipline. Men deserted their positions, disappearing into the jungle, never to be seen again. For the first time in the Pacific War, the Japanese army experienced something it had never known before: defeat. Meanwhile, the Americans adapted. They learned how to fight in the jungle, how to survive the heat, how to outthink their enemy. They built small outposts, established supply lines, and improved air defenses. Every day, their confidence grew. Every night, the Japanese grew weaker. Then came January 1943. The Japanese High Command, realizing the hopelessness of the situation, decided to evacuate the remaining troops. But they could not simply announce a retreat. It would be a national humiliation. So the operation was disguised as a resupply mission. The plan was simple: deceive the Americans into believing the Japanese were preparing a new offensive, while secretly pulling their men off the island under cover of darkness. For 3 long weeks, the evacuation continued. Every night, Japanese destroyers raced through the dark waters, picking up starving soldiers from hidden beaches. Many were too weak to climb the ropes. They had to be dragged aboard by their comrades. By the time it was over, only a few thousand remained. When the Americans finally realized what had happened, it was too late. Guadalcanal was theirs. The Japanese Empire had abandoned the island. For the first time in the Pacific, Japan had been forced to retreat, and that single event shattered the illusion of invincibility that had carried them since Pearl Harbor. The men who survived spoke little of it afterward. To many, Guadalcanal was a place best forgotten, but some could never forget. One Japanese officer later wrote, "The jungle consumed us. It was not the Americans who defeated us. It was hunger. It was fever. It was fear." And yet, from that devastation, a new kind of soldier was born. For the Americans, Guadalcanal became a symbol, proof that courage and endurance could overcome fear and chaos. The Marines who survived there would go on to fight at Tarawa, Saipan, and Iwo Jima, carrying with them the lessons learned in the swamps and shadows of Guadalcanal.